So I thought I'd make a return to YouTube. Well, I wanted to do this as a podcast, but I just thought it would be a little bit more engaging if you are able to access it via YouTube, as you can actually see me throughout the course of the recording. Although in saying that, this will probably be extracted and put up as a podcast so you can listen while you're doing day-to-day things, while you're training, etc. So what the topic for today is, upon returning from my time off, I thought that I'd share a bit of an insight in regards to my transformation coming from being relatively out of shape to competing back in August at the Bendigo Classic in the Classic Physique division. What I'll be sharing today is not only my nutrition, my training, some supplementation, etc., and some strategies implemented by me and my coach at the time, but I'll also be sharing with you some mental barriers that I faced, some challenges that I faced on a more personal level throughout the process, and sometimes at which I was not fully committed to the process, although I didn't stop, and it allowed me to reach that end goal, which was getting on stage. So without further ado, I'll make a start, and that takes us back to the initial photo, which you've probably seen on my transformations, on my Instagram, when I was relatively out of shape, the image of me in the mirror, and this would have been probably July to August 2018. And this was probably my lowest point. This was the point at which I was the most out of shape. I wasn't at my mental lowest, although from a training and nutrition perspective, it was definitely my worst point. Following some pretty traumatic times, I'll say, wasn't completely terrible. There's definitely worse things that happen to individuals. I decided, it's time that I get back into my training and nutrition, take it a little bit more seriously and lead by example, as I should have already been doing. So it would have been around August. I thought, let's commit myself to this. Got back in the gym, or at least I tried. So that's what I'm going to cover first. So getting back to the gym at the start, knowing that this was my profession, knowing that I should be look a certain way, or I'm expected to look a certain way, considering that I was training individuals to look pretty good, and I had some individuals who were looking great, some competing, etc. It put a lot of pressure on me in the start, and it became very difficult for me to complete full sessions at the gym, to be at the gym at the busier times at which I needed to train, to a point where I had a lot of anxiety around training at these points. And that made the month of August very difficult. So the month of August was pretty much me just trying to find my feet and trying to get that rhythm back and overcome that anxiety which I had. And what really helped me with this was finding a training partner or a close friend who I could train with on a regular basis at the time which I had available, which was great for me. What I will recommend for individuals who do struggle with this anxiety, because this is something which a lot of individuals came to me with this issue, that they had that anxiety around training and it made it very difficult, and that's why they needed a trainer. If this is you, either find a close friend who will train with you or alongside you, or just get yourself a trainer. Just bite the bullet and do it, because once you make a start, this is definitely the hardest point. Once you get consistency, once the confidence is back, you won't have this issue anymore. And I don't just say this because I'm a trainer myself. I say this because this genuinely worked for me, just finding that someone who could help me through it and help me find my feet again. It wasn't that I didn't know what to do. Obviously, I had a very good understanding of exactly what I needed to do. It was more just having that reassurance beside me. So August was more about just finding my feet. Diet wasn't really considered. And I did drop a little bit of weight in the month of August, although it wasn't good weight. A lot of it was stress related. But the most important thing for me was just regaining that consistency. So come September, I continued with that consistency. I didn't miss training sessions, but I didn't train a significant amount either. Diet was pretty much out of question. It was more the activity levels which elevated pretty significantly, and the training volume which went up. And during this period, I will make note that my business did take quite a hit, because I was more focused on myself rather than my clients. And at the time, because I wasn't really experienced in balancing the two, it did take away from my professional aspects. So September again was just about developing that consistency, and I did drop a little bit more weight, but it was nothing significant. But then come October, November is when I really focused on cleaning up my diet. I tracked calories relatively loosely. I still had time out. I still had time off with my friends. I still enjoyed meals. I still enjoyed a drink or two. So it wasn't a very serious period. Although in saying that, I was probably 80 to 90% of the way there, because I was eating relatively well. I was training very consistently, and my training volume had gone up a lot. So I was probably at this point training 5 to 6 days without question. Like, I didn't miss a day for anything really. I included mostly whole foods. I avoided takeaway foods. I avoided junk foods, and I avoided pretty much eating out as much as I possibly could. But this does not mean that I was dieting to 100% of my ability. I definitely was not. So end of November is when I was probably in the most reasonable shape I'd been in a long time. So I had, to some extent, visible abs. I built a little bit of muscle, and I looked pretty respectable. And this is probably where I felt best about myself, or the best I had in a long time. So I was able to really leap forward from here. Come December, January, which I'll lump into the 1 month, I decided to go on a short bulk, or a period in which I look at gaining excess muscle. So during this period, I did track calories, although my protein was relatively high at about 250 grams per day. Carbs were in excess of 300, and fats at around 70 grams. And considering this was a holiday season, I did end up putting on a fair amount of body fat along with muscle. So I think the highest I got to just after New Year's or Christmas would have been between 90 and 92 kilos. Didn't look good by any means with the top off, but in the singlets, I did look quite reasonable, at least compared to where I'd been at. So up to this point, this was end of January. Most of this was just, look, I didn't have any strict regimens. I didn't have any plans which I followed religiously. I didn't have any specific goals. It was more just enjoying the process, enjoying the training. And I never did stop training because I enjoyed it no matter what I had on. And when you get to that point, things become a hell of a lot easier. It was from February that things got a little bit more serious, and that was when I hired my coach, Cohen Castellane, and he was able to support me through it, teach me a lot, and really get me ready for what was my competition in August. At the start, it was just an idea, but as we began to execute, I really realized that, okay, let's do this, I can do it. Despite the doubts along the way, but we will get into that. So we started prepping at about 28 weeks out, which was February. So the first 4 to 6 weeks of the prep were based around re-establishing my health. Not to say my health was bad, but it was just optimizing everything. So moving forward, we could do everything right and get the most out of me. So by doing this, we started off, my calories would have been about 3,200, and across the period would have elevated to somewhere around 3,800 calories. And I was training 6 days a week, with the rest days, the calories being the same as well. Okay, so throughout this period, fats are relatively high, carbohydrates were relatively high as well, although anything which was harsh on digestion was completely avoided. So this meant I completely eliminated gluten, I completely eliminated dairy, and I eliminated any foods which I considered trigger foods, or foods which I thought that I reacted poorly to. I think for the first week as well, we had some liver in there, which I felt pretty good on it, but it didn't taste very good. So that it was those little foods which really did make a bit of a big difference, as well as increasing my overall vegetable intake, my fruit intake, just basically my nutritional diversity. So what we did, we kept the calories relatively high across this first period, and we kept the training volume relatively low. So it was 6 days a week, but the sessions were capped at about 40 minutes at a push-pull leg split. And we didn't look to overload too heavily, because all we wanted to do was just make sure we're in that right state from a health perspective to really leap forward later. I did progress in terms of physically, muscular development definitely, but when the calories got to around the 3,500 to 3,800 mark, we did start to see a little bit of fat gain, which was acceptable at the time. I'll also note that cardiovascular training was in from the start, just to ensure we could maintain an aerobic health base, which is a necessity in order to ensure you can get the best results out of yourself possible. If you can't uptake oxygen adequately, your recovery is going to be impaired, your fat loss ability is going to be impaired, your ability to contract is going to be impaired, so on and so forth. So I guess you could consider this period a bit of a recomp, although to some extent it was a little bit of a bulk. Okay, so that takes us up to about the 20 to 22 week mark, which in all honesty was where I started to loosen up a little bit more, which was not a good thing, of course, but when the prep being so lengthy, it was difficult for me to comply 100% at this stage, especially considering I come off a background of not having that kind of compliance for such a long time. So calories generally sat around the 3,000 mark. Rest day calories came lower. I will just add there, rest day calories remain higher to ensure recovery was optimized initially, although later down the track we did shift rest days downwards to ensure that these could be tailored more towards fat loss rather than this recovery component. This was especially the case when we were able to reduce training load to 5 days per week, but I will get to that at a later time. So, sorry. During this period, like I mentioned, I did slack off. We had the Easter period, during which I took some time off work, which also made things a little bit more difficult. And this probably took me up to like the 12 to 14 week mark as well. So it was probably an 8-week period in which I wasn't giving 100%. And there is a big difference between giving 95% and giving 100%, especially when it comes to comp prep. Because at that 95%, that 5% leeway sort of just gives you that little bit more, that sanity back, that human element back. Although when it's removed, you become more like a robot. You start to suffer because you literally have no room to move, which that's what comp prep is. And you have to learn to deal with that. So during this period, cardio stayed at about 70 minutes. So we still just focused on maintaining that aerobic base. And calories were still, like I mentioned, around the 3,000 mark. Training remained unchanged, although intensified. So this is something that I'm going to touch on as well. A lot of individuals, a lot of coaches, not to say this is wrong, they'll shift between training programs dependent on stages of the prep, dependent on their goals and whatnot. What our focus was maintaining a very similar approach with the training, although intensifying that through drop sets, rest pause sets, variability of executions, rep ranges, etc. What I liked about this was that we remain comfortable with the movements, and we remain well aware of what works and what doesn't work. So obviously on a weekly basis from 28 weeks, we'd remove what didn't work, what I didn't enjoy, and what for me just wasn't right. So you'd probably reached a point by about 20 weeks where we had a program which was consisted of exercise which I thoroughly enjoyed, was confident with, injury risk was minimized, there was no niggly pains and whatnot. What I liked about intensifying is, yes, you remain comfortable with these movements, and you're more likely to be able to give a 110%, because there's a good chance that if you're stalling on particular movements, it is not because the exercise is wrong for you, but instead because you're better off looking at recovery and nutrition to ensure that you can continue overloading. This is my opinion, obviously, but it is something which worked well for me and has worked well for clients. Not to say there shouldn't be any variability in your training across extended periods, but too much variability is not always necessary. So I'm going to take us forward to now the May-June period, when things became a lot more difficult. So if we're looking at May-June, this will probably be around the 12 to 8 week mark, weeks out from the competition. At this period was when I really focused on pulling everything in. So cardio went up to roughly around 100 minutes, didn't really exceed this. Training really intensified, so things all became a little bit more difficult. Had to give 100% in all sessions. This is reaching failure on pretty much all sets, or as many as possible, without risking recovery-based issues or injury risks. Okay, so we tightened up from here, and it's probably when we saw the most progression in body composition, because this is also where the stress was lowest, because stress for me probably became the worst in the last 4 weeks. And in the last 4 weeks is probably where I saw the least change on a weekly basis. Not to say the stress is responsible for this entirely, although I do believe to some extent this was the case. So in May-June period, that 8 to 12 weeks out mark, was when we also shifted training to 5 days per week. So at this point, calories would have still been around 2,500, 2,600. And every 10 days would diet break for about 3 days. And this is talking training every 10 training days. Rest days we completely didn't count, and the calories on these days were probably 1,800 to 2,000. The diet break periods would be somewhere around the 3,400 mark. and provided compliance was 100%, generally would see the scales move very little, if at all. And the only times which we wouldn't see the results we desired was when I would slip up, because on these diet breaks I did find that I had a lot more trouble complying, because once you start eating, it was much more difficult for me to stop. That's just being completely honest. So again, food groups at this period remained relatively steady. So I think my food groups were mainly your white rice, your salmon, your pomegranates, your vegetables were carrots, mushrooms. I had pumpkin seeds, Brazil nuts. Cod was a protein choice, even though I didn't particularly love it. Vegan protein, a little bit of chicken breast, pork fillet interchangeably, and kangaroo, which was a big staple in my prep. So at about 8 weeks out, I was pretty confident with how I was looking, moving forward, despite some ups and downs. But then we're going to take it up to the 4 to 8 week mark, or we'll say 5 to 8. So the 5 to 8 week mark was when things started to get a lot more difficult, and that's when cheats I completely eliminated. I no longer ate anything that wasn't on my plan, and if I did to some extent slip up, it was just excess of something which was on my plan. For example, having additional rice, which is obviously not that fun, but it's something that you needed to do. So my low day shifted around the 1600 to 1800 calorie mark, and cardio started to push up that little bit more. But I will note the cardio never reached above 150 minutes per week, split as I desired. Although at this point they were probably sitting between 100 and 120 minutes. So calories would have been 2.4 at this point, which wasn't that far above what I hit at the very end. We had no control over our water, wasn't monitored at all, provided I hit a base of it. And there was no regulation of salt at this point either. And I will emphasize that my training program here was changed for the final time, and we did not change it other than intensifying the programming between about 7 to 8 weeks out and show day. And again, this was just to ensure that we were sticking with exercise which I was comfortable with and those which I could get the most out of. So, for example, I chose a seated chest press over a barbell bench press because for me, I could get a lot more out of that movement. I was more comfortable pushing that movement to failure than that of a barbell bench press. This is just an example, and many individuals, you shouldn't be programming someone an exercise which they don't particularly enjoy, because if they don't enjoy it, unless it's super superior to the alternative that they desire, there's a good chance they're not going to get 110% out of it. They're not going to push it all the way to a failure. They're not going to look forward to it. And to me, for that 1% difference, you're better off picking an exercise which they are comfortable with and they do enjoy. So diet breaks remain consistent in this 4 to 8 week period. And I think at one point we even did a 5-day diet break. And at this 5-day diet break, I actually lost weight. So calories were at like 3,400, despite being deficited at like 2,400 on training and 1,600 on rest, or thereabouts. So then that takes us into the last month. And the last month, that's where things get very difficult, and that's where it really hit me like I didn't expect. Like I didn't expect things to become as difficult as they did. But it's all part of the journey, and it's something which I needed to deal with. I'd committed to it now, and I wanted to make it to the final day, despite my ups and downs. So at about 4 weeks out, calories would have been 2,200, which had my carbs at about 210. Protein was still at about 180 grams. And the protein was quite low, simply based on a HCl issue which I had, which was basically I was experiencing reflux, and by having the protein higher than that, it would impair my digestion. As a result, I wouldn't get the results I desired from it. So in the last 4 weeks, we maintained about here, and we had 3-day diet breaks occasionally in which we trial peak. And this is where I'm not going to say health issues, but the complications started to arise, such as lack of libido, such as chronic sleep issues, frequent urination, extreme sensitivity to the cold. And this is where I was very flat, very emotionless, and had bad waves of energy. But again, something you just need to expect with a prep, and something that is part of it. If you're not willing to deal with those kind of things, it's probably not for you. And you need to weigh up whether if you are experiencing these kinds of sides, if it's going to impact your professional life, your relationships, etc., and if those can deal with these complications. So I was flattening out to a point where at the end of sessions I would almost collapse. Cardio became very difficult, and even maintaining a jog could be extremely challenging. But nonetheless, you get it done no matter what you do. And then probably so that takes up to probably the 2 week out mark, at which calories were 2,300 on training days and 1,400 on rest. And I was doing an hour of cardio on both rest days, and then 15 minutes on 2 of my training days. And not necessarily fasted. I didn't see a need to do fasted cardio. I don't see too much of a benefit in doing fasted cardio from my understanding and what my coach understood as well. So that was something we completely avoided. We started loading in water at 2 weeks out at about 6.5 litres a day. At 6.5 litres a day, I was going to the toilet sometimes twice an hour. Through the night, I'd wake up 5 or 6 times to go to the toilet as well. And that made things a lot more difficult, but it was something that needed to be done. So at the 1 week out period, we did try a few trial peaks. So I remember we did our depletion, basically just stuck to our diet from the Monday to Friday from the 2 weeks out mark. And then the Saturday and Sunday, we tried loading in carbohydrates. And I think on this week, I actually trained 6 times. So at this point, I would load all my water prior to training in the evening on the Saturday and Sunday. And then I found if I had my carbohydrate meal following, which was my final meal, and then cut water, that was when I did look my very best. And that is something that I wish I did execute on competition day, although we did cut water for 24 hours. And unfortunately, the results weren't as great as the week before, but it's something you sort of just need to deal with. First competition you learn for next time, but I know for next time exactly what I would do in regards to peaking. So then that would be my last carb up before the day. So we did that, and then come the Monday, went back to depletion, pushed the carbohydrates a little bit lower. I can't remember exactly what they were here, but we loaded in about 150 minutes of cardio within the first 3 days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. At this point, I was very depleted, but seeing the light at the end of the tunnel makes it a lot easier because you know that you're almost there. You're essentially almost there. And at this point, I would have been hovering around the 76 to 78 kilogram mark, which was, my stage weight was actually 77.4 kilograms, and that was with a 24-hour water fast. So come the Thursday, we maintained depletion, and then Friday we started introducing carbohydrates of the evening. We did something a little bit different to we had done before. We'd done the week before. We complicated a little bit further, and for me, I felt like that complication was unnecessary. So something that I will preach moving forward, and I will apply to the clients who I do have competing early next year, is we will change as few variables as possible. Maintain what you're doing. If you're not ready, you're just simply not ready. Manipulating water, manipulating your intake, trying new things, 1 week out's not the time to do it. And if you need to do these kind of things to push you over the edge, unless you're going for some kind, you're competing at some kind of professional level where you're really going to be neck and neck with some of the world's best, it's probably not necessary to take those risks for a 1 to 5% improvement in your composition. We introduced all those carbohydrates at night, and then the day of the show, we cut water, I will make note of, about 5 p.m. on the Friday. The day of the show, we stayed carbs in across the morning up till about 1 p.m. Water was still completely eliminated. And then we filled up on rice cakes leading up to the competition, which was at around 7 p.m. And I think I cut these about 2 hours before. Before going on stage, we did red wine, we did pomegranate juice, we did a pre-workout, a very simple pre-workout, just to get that last bit of a fill up. And then before we knew it, we were on stage and we had presented the package that we had. So the one thing I learned from that, again, like I mentioned before, is just maintain the variables. Don't try new things and keep consistent. So that takes me up to, that's the variation between the start and the end of my transformation and the process that I went through, as much as, and I tried to give a little bit of an insight as to some of the things I went through, although I've obviously kept this relatively brief. I will make note that my professional life and my relationships took a massive hit in the last 4 weeks of comp prep. As I did mention earlier, it is going to definitely be a challenge, but was definitely worse than I anticipated. So just be well aware of this. Another tip I will give is start your posing as early as possible, because I left mine very late, and as a result, it's just another stress which you don't need. It's completely unnecessary stress. You should have that mastered quite early. The earlier you have that mastered, the earlier you'll have one less thing to worry about. And on top of that, you'll be able to better see where your physique is at, rather than comparing in photos where mirror shots or just photos where you're just standing in the middle of a room. You can easily identify your weak points, and you can identify points where you may be holding more body fat as well. Throughout the course of the prep, supplementation was relatively simple. I think I was using, from memory, a vitamin D supplement, magnesium, betaine HCl, because I did have a lot of digestive issues towards the end. I used that towards the start, cut it out through the middle, towards the end reintroduced that, because we need to make sure everything was running smoothly. Creatine for methylation, beta-alanine for conversion to zinc carnosine to support digestion as well. Ashwagandha for stress, not that it helped too much. Some 5-HTP for mood elevation towards the end. And then there was a few things that were in and out interchangeably as well. Although off the top of my head, I can't exactly remember what they were, although they were of less significance than what I have mentioned thus far. So that's pretty much from start to finish my transformation. I hope that it gave you some kind of insight in regards to what to expect and some challenges you may face, and how to really periodize everything throughout the course of even just a simple dieting phase. But if you do have any further questions, I do encourage asking them below, and I'll try to offer a little bit more of an insight moving forward, maybe some smaller snippets in which I can get a little bit more in depth across the specific periods, because obviously this being full length was difficult for me to do so. So thank you for tuning in and listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.